the ongoing narrative of the Komagata Maru. The Komagata Maru tragedy of 1914 occurred at the very time when racism and white supremacy was reaching its peaking point in BC and Canada. The illegal torment and eventual denial of these 354, mostly men, there were 2 women, on board the ship epitomizes the racism in existence and on a global scale on both the parts of the Canadian governments and imperial British powers. Despite this piece in its history of development and growth, Canadian histories, as seen in standardized school textbooks, ignores this, just as it has so many other tragedies in Canadian history. Pushing this narrative a little further, I would argue that unless this overlooking of Canadian racist history changes, ignorance will remain and suffice as an excuse to propagate stereotyping of visible minorities and Aboriginal groups. If, however, histories are written to reflect humanisms, affects, and emotions, as well as a continuous methodological narrative, it has the potential to change the perceptions of the ignorant. Thus, my presentation today will analyze the difference between popular historical writings on the Komagata Maru and from those writing from a passionate and communal perspective versus historians who have written on the exact same historical events and or characters, but who have remained distant from the narrative. By doing so, I hope to demonstrate the potential risks in being too detached and negating the very realities of the time and how these detached narratives shape society today. Before I delve into the varying analysis and interpretations on the details of the tragedy within itself, I want to compare how historians have contextualized and framed the Komagata Maru within the larger landscape of Canadian immigration policies. I begin by analyzing the very passionate book, and rightfully so, of the man at the crux of the venture, Gurdit Singh. Gurdit Singh became a writer following the KGM's, I'll call Komagata Maru KGM from now on, KGM's denial so he could counter the report of the Komagata Maru Committee of Inquiry, which was published by the Government of India via Imperial British powers in 1914. Gurdit Singh's book, The Voyage of Komagata Maru or India Slavery Abroad, provides the contextual framework needed to understand the setting leading up to the KGM and the status quo of racism which was very much in place in the early and mid-20th century. Certainly, Gurdit Singh's writings will be biased. This is not being disclaimed. However, Gurdit Singh's accounts on his and his fellow passengers' unjust treatment during their forced stay in the ship needs to be recorded in the larger historical narrative. The fact that Gurdit Singh labeled his original book in Gurmukhi or Punjabi as Zul Nikatha, i.e. India Slavery Abroad, sets the imperial stage for the KGM. According to Gurdit Singh, while he worked as a contractor in the Malaya states, he witnessed firsthand the cruel treatments of his fellow Indians, claiming that, quote, an Indian coolie is not worth even a small fraction of what a horse fetches, and quote, color prejudice is almost a disease with the Europeans. In ending the chapter titled India Slavery Abroad, Gurdit Singh very powerfully sets the stage for the racial climate in Canada. And this is a quote from his book, translated into English. What most grievously hurt them was that Indians living in Canada had sent for their wives and children who purchased tickets up to Hong Kong, as there was no direct steamship service to Canada, and thence to Canada. When they were about to land, the Canadian government stopped them with an order to return back to Hong Kong. Pause for a moment to imagine the heart-rending scene on the docks. Fathers had come to receive their children. Husbands had come to receive their wives, but the Canadian government's brutal order stood between them. To sigh and shed tears in silence was all they could do. I would argue that by including such a shocking yet true statement, whereby Gurdit Singh asks the reader to pause for a moment, this only adds to the historical recognizing of what the reality was. Gurdit Singh's emotional plea differs very differently from the portrayal W. Peter Ward makes in his chapter on the KGM in the book White Canada Forever. Ward seems to believe that the primary interest of almost all the early South Asian migrants to BC was to send their earnings back to their families in India. And his quote, for these reasons, East Indians in Canada were almost exclusively male sojourners. Perhaps even more than their Chinese counterparts, their chief object was to earn surplus wealth and remit it to family members across the Pacific, end quote. Ward doesn't seem to recognize that there occurred a shift whereby the early migrating South Asians in BC opted to remain in BC and build lives with their families, as opposed to returning to Punjab. Ward also discounts Canadian government restrictive policies in reuniting families by saying, quote, immigration law placed no special limitation upon the entry of Indian women and children because existing regulations apply to all regardless of age and sex, end quote. This discounting of the inability for South Asian men in BC to unite with their families is problematic. To those South Asian men, living in crowded bunkhouses without the comfort of domestic life was certainly not ideal. Therefore, in their eyes, immigration restrictions from 1908 onwards was exactly that, an attempt to morally harm them by not allowing them to live the normal domestic lives in BC with their families. The tragedy of non-reunification between South Asian men and their family or wives has been looked at by many scholars, each of which discount Ward's viewpoint. Even when special concession was made for the wives and children of two Sikh priests, for example, Bhag Singh and Balwant Singh, that was still under the pretext that no other wives or children would be allowed to enter BC. As was articulated by Hopkinson and mentioned by Hugh Johnston in The Voyage of the Komagata Maru, the Sikh challenge to Canada's color bar. And the quote in Hugh's book says, "It was the CID man Hopkinson seeking to take the issue away from the two priests who suggested that the minister should allow the two women and their children to stay while making it clear that other Indians could not expect the same concession." Another historian, Kesar Singh, in his publication, Canadian Sikhs and Komagata Maru Massacre, describes how the concern of wives and children not being allowed into BC was even brought into the British Parliament, and he includes a motion or something attempted to being discussed in the British Parliament, and it's called the Hindu Question in the British Parliament. And it says, Mr. Joseph King asked the Secretary of State for the colonies whether the wives and families of Sikhs settled in British Columbia were now allowed to join their husbands, and whether the promise to this effect, given on January 21st, 1912 by the Honourable Mr. R. Rogers, Canadian Minister of the Interior, was now being acted upon. Mr. Harcourt, Secretary of State for the Colonies, I have no information as to the alleged promise by Mr. Rogers or as to its being acted upon, end quote. That's from Kesar Singh's book. It's evident that the British imperial powers had no intention of interfering with restrictive and racist Canadian immigration policies. If the South Asian men had no intention of staying in Canada in the early 20th century, as Ward argues, then why was there such a push to allow their wives and children to be allowed into BC as well? Why bother to bring the issue of wives and families all the way to the British Parliament? During the 2 months from May 23rd, 1914 until July 23rd, 1914, when the KGM remained docked on the shores of Vancouver, the passengers were inflexed with a range of denials. They were denied visitation and counsel by their lawyer. They were denied communication with members of the shore committee. They were denied water and food, and they were denied basic human dignity. How have these denials, because of a racist Canadian government, been portrayed historically? In terms of the dishonest and sneaky tactics utilized by Canadian government officials, Ali Kazmi refers to a number of instances and undesirables. One such example cited by Kazmi was the government disallowing communication between Gurdit Singh and his counsel J.E. Bird. And even with the very little communication granted, there was no confidentiality, quote, as was supposed to be guaranteed by the rule of law, unquote, from Kazmi's book. Hugh Johnston refers to the bizarre situation between J.E. Bird and his lack of communication with his own clients, stating, quote, Bird wanted to see his clients but was barred from the ship. The immigration officials would carry letters, which were no substitute for an interview, but they did not want a lawyer running back and forth between Sikhs on shore and those on the boat. Gurdit Singh, Bird complained, is even more a prisoner than if he were in a penitentiary. End quote. By including Bird's argument that Gurdit Singh was even more of a prisoner than if he had been in a penitentiary, it becomes a powerful and metaphorical statement, although it does not in any way take away from the credibility of the narrative history. Others also make reference to the passengers essentially becoming prisoners on their own ship, including historian Sohan Singh Josh, who writes, quote, Gurdit Singh wasn't allowed to land. In fact, he and his passengers were made prisoners on the Komagata Maru. The naval guard surrounded the ship and prevented any hired boats going near her. One could go near the ship only with the permission of Reed aboard a government launch when a end quote. When reading Josh's piece, as seen in Kesar Singh's publication, the reader truly begins to gain a sense of the imprisonment that the KGM passengers would have felt for those 2 months. Norman Buchignani and all, in their book A Continuous Journey, also make reference to other cheating policies on part of the Canadian government when referring to measures taken to deny the passengers based on supposed health issues. According to Buchignani, quote, "The government also had its strategy ready. To make the deportation proceedings more certain, the government used an old trick, finding non-existent disease in prospective immigrants. 90 passengers were declared to have trachoma, and thus to be ineligible as immigrants," end quote. Buchignani's analysis adds a unique perspective, especially when he claims that such tactics were an old trick used by Canadian immigration officials to deport the unwanted. The dire situation in terms of lack of supplies added yet another piece to an already layered set of dilemmas Gurjit Singh and his passengers faced. Buchignani makes a reference to this aspect in saying, quote, "On board, conditions grew worse. By June 25th, there was virtually no drinking water on board and food supplies were low. The weight of this, i.e. running short on food supplies, in conjunction with every other challenge the passengers were facing as essential prisoners, could not and should not be underestimated." Johnson explains the back and forth between Gurjit Singh and Reid in terms of the demands for provisions in great detail, saying, quote, "For 2 days, Gurjit Singh had been telling officials that his people had very little to eat. Reid was unimpressed, although he sent up 200 tons of water. When Gurjit Singh announced a hunger strike, Reid scoffed. Apparently, Reid didn't believe Gurjit Singh because the Japanese captain claimed that the men were cooking secretly in the night. Interestingly, Johnson goes on to explain, quote, "By the end of the week, real hunger had taken the ship, although Gurjit Singh and the 4 or 5 close to him still had food in their kitchen, which was separate from the common kitchen." Can you pass me that? So irrespective of Gurjit Singh's own circumstances, there was no doubting that supplies ran low on the ship, and the question of responsibility came into play. According to Gurjit Singh, the responsibility fell solely on himself as the charterer to provide provisions, and this is a quote from Gurjit Singh. The question arises as to who was responsible to supply provisions, etc., to the passengers of the SS KGM. The charterer, according to Section 44 of the Immigration Act, is, in the first place, responsible. It would seem that although Gurjit Singh was fully aware of his responsibilities, illegal restrictions placed on him prevented him from enacting those responsibilities. And another quote from Gurjit Singh, "I was neither allowed to land, nor make shed for the passengers, nor deposit security for them." Kesar Singh conveys a deeper emotional sentiment with respect to the lack of provisions when he describes the details of a letter sent to Reid on July 13th, which says, "We have the honor to inform you that we are suffering without water from yesterday. The Japanese are allowed to take water from the shore while we are kept thirsty. The cruelty of immigration men to allow Japanese water and keeping Hindus thirsty is an extraordinary one." Kazmi expresses similar sentiments in claiming that Malcolm Reid, quote, "used his own discretion to determine when food and water would be delivered to the passengers, at times pushing them to the edge of unbearable thirst and starvation," end quote. Only Gurjit Singh or those passengers on board could shed the historical light on what transpired during those tumultuous times. In his analysis of the KGM, unfortunately, Ward makes absolutely no mention of such cheating tactics on part of the Canadian government, or the lack of communication allowed between Bird and Gurjit Singh. In fact, Bird isn't mentioned once, or most significantly, the lack of provisions provided. Without these denials being recognized historically, there is no recognition of the deep entrenched hate and racism which fed governmental policies and the suffering the passengers faced because of it. Indeed, without the specific emotional details ever being relayed, one cannot truly understand or even believe when Gurjit Singh describes, quote, "The hardship suffered by the passengers of the SS KGM and the cruel, illegal, and inhuman treatment meted out to us by the Canadian government." Okay, the final angle I'll analyze in this paper is when after 2 months of back and forth and struggle, the KGM was escorted to return back to Hong Kong, India by the HMCS Rainbow. And it is here where the center of my argument falls and the dangers of what can happen when an entire historical narrative, emotion and all, is not recognized. There exists near the Skybus terminal in Vancouver, BC, a fairly recent memorial erected in honor of the KGM. This memorial had been funded by the Citizenship and Immigration Canada's Community Historical Recognition Program, with the support of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation. This so-called memorial states the following. On May 23, 1914, the steamship Komagata Maru arrived in Coal Harbor after a 7-week crossing from Hong Kong via Japan. The ship was carrying 376 Indians from India and the Far East who claimed right of entry as citizens of the British Empire. Most of the passengers were not permitted to land based on the continuous passage order and other prejudicial regulations that prevented Indian immigration. While supported campaign for the passengers' right to disembark, the ship remained anchored approximately 1 kilometer offshore from where you are now standing. During this time, the Cause of the One Society helped supply the passengers with food and water. On July 23rd, the Komagata Maru and its passengers were escorted out of the harbor by a Canadian Navy vessel and sent back to India. The Komagata Maru incident was a catalyst for change to Canadian citizenship and immigration laws. This monument reflects Canada's commitment to a nation where differences are respected and traditions are honored. This memorial epitomizes public manifestation of what can happen when histories, especially traumatic histories, are either misconstrued or not fully presented. Almost 100 years later, the true facts are underrepresented and then presented on a public format by the Canadian government. This memorial makes no mention of the mental and physical torture administered by the Canadian government, and no recognition that these Indians, and this is going to totally alter all the conversations we've been having about them having a right to come anywhere in the British Empire, so you can ignore this, but what I say is, and no recognition that these Indians had every right to enter Canada as British citizens, not simply something that was claimed. Furthermore, it's a fact that the KGM was not escorted by the HMCS Rainbow. The word escort implies that the Rainbow was guiding the Komagata Maru for its own protection. Buchignani very fittingly describes this episode in his book as the Battle of Burrard Inlet, and not as an escorting. Johnston appropriately refers to the tug Sea Lion incident in his chapter titled Intimidation, for that's what it was. Although Johnston's account differs slightly from Buchignani in that he claims there was one passenger on board the Komagata Maru who did fire a gun, though no one on the Sea Lion was injured. Johnston's retelling of one of the passengers on board the ship helps shed light on the spirit and mood aboard the ship. Quote, "If we tell you all our troubles," Daljit Singh wrote his friends in a note intercepted by immigration, "it will be giving you trouble. They are trying to deport us forcibly, and they will tell you afterwards that the ship was taken away by the passengers. About 1:30 this morning, a tugboat came full of police and tried to get on board by intimidation and tried to capture Baba Gurdit Singh. With the help of Guru, we won and saved the honor of our flag. We are ready to die and kill. We will not take the boat away without your orders, and then only when they put provisions and water on the boat first." End quote. Following the Battle of Burrard Inlet, and once they received their necessary provisions for the fateful return back, the KGM had no other option but to leave. Ward's analysis of the lead-up to the disembarking of the ship makes no mention of any struggle or intimidation taking place, instead asserting the very minimalistic narrative that, quote, "Tension increased when, on the eve of their expected deportation, the Indians seized control of the ship and repulsed a midnight boarding raid of 150 policemen and immigration officers." End quote. It's disturbing that Ward does not delve into the needed dialogues about the intimidation factors on part of the Canadian government, ironically much like the memorial erected almost 100 years later. As I reach the conclusion of this paper, I need to reiterate that there are many more aspects of the KGM which need to have a historical and historiographical light shed on. These include the various historical interpretations of the Budge tragedy massacre, the assassination of William Hopkinson, the acquittal of murderer Bela Singh, the hanging of Bela Singh, as well as the underground years of Gurdit Singh. All of these will have their own historical trajectories and narratives, as has been demonstrated in the very few examples I've provided on specific aspects of the KGM. Much needs to be explored, and this includes the histories in all its aspects, including the emotion. By the time Gurditsing returned to Bajbaj, and after he had seen such hardship, corruption, pain, and suffering, he befittingly and tragically wrote in his book, quote, "No free country in the world could have borne this treatment, but poor Mother India was trodden underfoot, her blood, her manhood has been sucked by centuries of foreign rule, nothing is left for Indians but sigh for their fate." End quote. After reading the various historiographies on the story of the KGM, do we discount Gurditsing's claim as biased? Or should we not be able to include his passionate statement as historical fact? How do historians make amends between the emotional narratives versus the factual representatives as seen with the varying interpretations of the Komagata Maru? Whose historical narrative can be taken as historical fact? Certainly, Gurditsing and Kesar Singh's writings are driven by passion and emotion, and I would argue rightfully so. However, the works of Darshan Singh Tatla, Ali Kazmi, Hugh Johnston, and Norman Bujignani are ideal examples of creating a balance between what a historian represents, while at the same time placing the appropriate respect to the traumas that the communities have faced. Thank you.